Every club. Every day. The Global Sports Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome back to the Daily Fulham Podcast. My name is Gavin Ruffle and today is Friday. Today is your regular Friday preview. I will be looking ahead to the game on the weekend as Fulham take on Nottingham Forest. I'll be talking a little bit about Forest and the season they've had before giving my usual predictions and what we can expect in terms of team news. But before I do that, I just want to take a moment to mention that today's episode is a special milestone. It is the 100th episode of the Daily Fulham Podcast. And I have been a part of that since day one. I have been a part of most of the 100 episodes. And whilst I'd like to give myself some credit, of course this wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for a couple of people. So I'd like to thank Nick and Ken for starting up the Global Sports Podcast Network. Without them giving me the opportunity, I wouldn't be here today. I'd also like to thank all of the guests on the crossover episodes. My two co-hosts, there was two of us to start with, then there was three, now it's just me doing the solo episodes, but I want to thank everyone that's been a part of this journey, everyone who's been on the Daily Fulham Podcast for their contribution, and hopefully there's many more episodes to come. And of course I can't forget the people that listen to this great podcast. If it wasn't for you guys, then there probably wouldn't be a podcast, in all honesty, and I just want to thank you all for your time you've given, whether you've been here from day one or whether you're a recent listener to this podcast. You're all equally welcome, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to me and some of my terrible musings on Fulham, on today's football. It's extremely appreciated. Wherever you're tuning in from, I know we get listeners from across the world, all different continents, so this is a moment for me from the bottom of my heart to say thank you, and hopefully you'll tune into many more episodes on the Daily Fulham Podcast. But enough of the sentimental stuff, let's get into it. Well, I haven't had a chance to give my reaction to the FA Cup draw. I gave my reaction to the performance against Wigan Athletic, but since then we have had the FA Cup draw, which has pitted Fulham against Manchester United. Lo and behold, Manchester United were one of the teams I said Fulham would probably want to avoid, not because Manchester United are ripping up any trees this season, but just because they seem to have a really good record against Fulham. And no matter where Manchester United are in terms of confidence, in terms of form, they seem to rock up, play Fulham. It all goes right for them. They either win with a late goal or a fortunate deflection. It just seems a fixture that doesn't go so well for Fulham. If we look back on the one a few weeks back, that typified it kind of, didn't it really? Because Manchester United didn't threaten so much, and then Lisandro Martinez pops up with the flukiest goal you'll ever see. Of course, it evokes memories, doesn't it, of what happened 2 seasons ago where Fulham were in control of the game, 1-0 up, and then they hit the self-destruct button and managed to get 3 people, save people because the manager was one of them, sent off in the space of a minute and a half. So you can't lose to Manchester United 3 times in the season, can you? Surely not. That's something to look forward to another day. That'll get going at the start of March. But yeah, it's a good opportunity in some ways, the fact that they have lost them twice this season, just to get their own back, and hopefully, maybe, fingers crossed, they can lift their first piece of major silverware. What we are going to see in that game is the use of semi-automated offsides, and I know Leicester City fans will be thinking, well, where the hell was that in the last round? Because if that was around in the 4th round, then it could be Fulham playing Leicester City, as Harry Maguire popped up with a blatant offside winner. So just on all semi-automated offsides, I'm fully in favour of that. I'm actually one of the rare advocates of VAR. I think it improves decision making. I think the biggest problem with VAR is the officials that use it, and that's a problem in this country, isn't it? The standard of officiating. But I think VAR is a good system as long as the people using it are adept at their job, which as we've seen in the Premier League, finding good officials is pretty rare. But I think the semi-automated offsides, I think we've seen in tournaments in the last what was the last major tournament? Well, whatever the last major tournament was, they used it and it seemed to work quite well. It worked quite smoothly. I think one of the problems, one of the bugbears for fans, particularly match-going fans, is when they're sat there, there's often a long wait, 2 or 3 minutes waiting for them to put the lines up and to decide whether it's offside or not. So the fact that we can get those decisions made quicker just makes the process a lot more smoother, and I think you want the right decisions, don't you, first and foremost, and if you can quicken the process up, then I'm all in favour of it. That's something that he's going to be trialled for the 5th round, and it's something there's talk about it being implemented towards the end of the season. So yeah, I'm fully on board with that. That's a tick in a box for me. Definitely, it's a step in the right direction, introducing that. But back to the league action, and Fulham do take on Nottingham Forest this weekend. Nottingham Forest are having an incredible season, and I'll talk a little bit more about Forest in the second part. But if you can cast your mind back to the game earlier in the season, where Fulham won 1-0, they'll be looking to do the double over Nottingham Forest this season, become, I believe, the first team to do that. Yeah, if you look at the encounter at the City Ground, it was a pretty low-key affair, very boring game, to put it bluntly. Not much happened. Raul Jimenez scored a second half penalty. Luckily for him, I think Andres Pereira was off the pitch at that time. Otherwise, there might have been a squabble over it and he might have ended up taking it, and they wouldn't have won the game. But they did win that game 1-0. One of very few Nottingham Forest defeats this season. So hopefully for Fulham, they can look to do the double. If you look at this fixture last season, this was an incredible performance, incredible result where Fulham won 5-0. I think the most eye-catching goal was a Raul Jimenez back heel, and that was during a period, if you can recall, where Fulham had back-to-back games at Craven Cottage and they won 5-0. They won that game, and there was subsequent noise about Steve Cooper and his position at the club. He ended up leaving less than 2 weeks later, and then they followed that up beating West Ham 5-0 as well, before the fun ended away at Newcastle when Raul Jimenez decided to stick his backside in someone's face. But hey, that was last season, and Fulham have written the wrongs of Newcastle from last season as they've done the double over them, so they'll try and make it another game where they can do the double over a team, but it certainly won't be easy given the way Forest have been playing, given the side that Nuno Espirito Santo has built and made them a formidable team in the Premier League. More on that formidable team in the second part, but before then, let me just tell you a little bit about our sponsors. Here at the Global Sports Podcast Network, we spent a lot of time selecting our delivery platform. Zencastr came out the clear winner. With 4K video recording from your phone and AI editing that automatically removes all those ums and ahs, it's super easy to start a podcast that sounds great and is delivered efficiently. If you're ready to tell your story, check out the link in the show description to learn more about Zencastr. On to Nottingham Forest now then, and they've exceeded everyone's expectations, haven't they? Third in the league, 3 points behind Arsenal, 10 points behind Liverpool, but there's 14 games left to go in the season and they have a realistic chance of qualifying for the Champions League. We don't know at this stage. It's pretty likely that there'll be 5 teams that go into next year's Champions League, so there's every chance that Nottingham Forest can stay there despite pressure coming from Chelsea and Manchester City, Newcastle behind them. They're still in a good position to achieve that goal, and even if they are to fall short, then there's always the chance of Europa League, there's always a chance of Europa Conference League, and that would still be deemed a successful season for them. Because when I was giving my predictions for what this season had in store, I believe I had Nottingham Forest down there getting relegated, just based on what we kind of seen the last couple of seasons. And there are parallels between these two clubs and the fact that they came up at the same time, and Nottingham Forest, they had that kind of scattergun approach in the transfer window where they were spending a lot of money on players that probably weren't deemed necessarily, were kind of luxury players, maybe not spending the money on the right areas and investing in the squad in the wisest possible way. But whatever way you look at it, they've reaped the rewards from that approach. Despite the points deduction last season and incurring the wrath of PSR, if you were ever to get a points deduction, then last season was probably the season to do it, because the 3 teams that got relegated were a long way short, weren't they? So just based on what I kind of seen in the last 2 seasons, I thought this would be another tricky season for the Tricky Trees, but it's proved anything but as you can't help but be impressed by the form they've shown. They had that streak a little while back where they won 5 or 6 games in a row, and there was even talk potentially going into that Liverpool game, if they could turn Liverpool over, that they might even, as ridiculous as it sounds, of being title contenders. And I don't think they're in the running for the title, but there's no doubt that they're bang in the mix for Champions League. And given the defeat against Bournemouth, there probably would have been a lot of talk about, well, this is the time they stumbled, this is where they drop off now, the bubbles burst, and we'll see them revert to type, almost sort of thing. They kind of run their race, but they dispelled that theory emphatically in the next game when they completely tore Brighton apart, didn't they? Beating them 7-0. So it shows the strength of character within that set of players, that they can react from setbacks, from disappointments, going down 5-0, and then a week later they can completely flip it on its head. And it shows that they've got some cojones, for want of a better term, in that dressing room. And Nuno Espirito Santo has built a really good Premier League squad now, hasn't he? And very much like Fulham, they had a quiet January, like a lot of teams in the Premier League. And I always feel that if you do a lot of spending in January, it's probably indicative of the form your club's in. It's indicative of the position where you are in the league. The fact that Nottingham Forest have overachieved this season meant they were quite happy, they were quite satisfied to continue with what they have for the remainder of the season. And I think you've got to respect that, haven't you? And there's always a willingness from fans to want you to sign players, but not always for the right reason. I'm sure Nuno, if there were players there that could improve the squad, that could genuinely add something whilst being in a reasonable price range, then I'm sure he would have looked at doing that. But as it stands, I think he feels he has a squad there that can, for his sake, stay the course and really challenge the upper echelon of teams in the Premier League, and possibly do the unthinkable, which would be qualifying for the Champions League. There is the talk at the moment, is there, about the gap widening potentially from the Championship to the Premier League, how we saw the three promoted teams go straight back down last season, how it could be the same again. And I think for the sake of the league, the healthiness of the league, you don't want that to be happening. You don't want that gap to be widening. So the fact that these two sides came up together back in 2022, and along with Bournemouth are cemented in the top half, it shows what you can achieve. Nottingham Forest had a little bit of a different approach, as I said. They were more aggressive with their spending. Ryan Yates is the sole survivor from that promotion winning campaigns, but there's more than one way to skin a cat, isn't there? And they are reaping the rewards from that approach. One of the players they have brought in, who's just put pen to paper on a new deal, is Chris Wood, and he's been an absolute revelation this season. I say revelation, some people might deem that as being patronising, and I don't see it that way at all. I think Chris Wood is probably not the most eye-catching, glamorous of names, but he's forged a really successful career and shown he can be an effective striker at this level when there probably were doubts about him in the past. If you look back to his time at Burnley, in a team in Burnley that are going to be towards the bottom end of the table most seasons, they're not going to have a lot of the ball, they're not going to create a lot of chances. He managed to get double figures Premier League goals for 4 seasons in a row. Went to Newcastle at an interesting time, just when they had the Saudi ownership, and I think a lot of Newcastle fans' eyebrows were raised at that signing because they were expecting money to be spent on more glamour names. But the big Kiwi, he's just gone from strength to strength now. The other side of 30, and he's playing the best football of his career. He seems to have found a real good home. It's a real good fit for him. And his form, he's continued it. And we talk about Nottingham Forest's bubble being burst as a side. Well, Chris Wood has just carried on that form throughout the season, and there's no signs of him stopping. And when Forest fans heard the news about him signing a new contract, then that would have been music to their ears, just as it was when Murillo signed his new contract. Murillo, a different end of the spectrum, because he's just on the start of his journey. He's only 22 years of age. He's put pen to paper, I believe, until summer of 2029. Whether or not he stays at Nottingham Forest for the length of his contract remains to be seen. I suppose it depends where Nottingham Forest are as a football club, whether this season is a one-off or whether this is a sign of things to come, and it can mean that they are challenging at the top end of the table, consistently looking at getting into Europe. Then I'm sure he'll be committed to the project. But if that isn't going to be the case, then he'll have his suitors from elsewhere, because he is a really talented footballer and he would fit into a lot of top teams. Talking about Chris Wood, this being the perfect fit for him, well, it certainly applies to the manager, doesn't it? Because he had his time at Wolves, he took them from the Championship up into the Premier League, and they became an established top half Premier League side, and Wolves have not quite rekindled that sort of form since his departure, where they finished 7th back-to-back seasons were playing in European competition. And he's found his home now after a brief time at Spurs, where things went well to begin with. they suddenly started to subside. And when you're taking charge of a side that's that so-called Big Six, where the expectations, the scrutiny is that bit greater, any dip in form is heightened because of that. And there's the pressure from within, there's the pressure from outside as well. So he's found a home at Nottingham Forest now where the expectations are lesser, but he's achieving more. And if the Premier League were to end now, what would happen in terms of manager of the season? It'll go to Arne Slot, because it always goes to the Premier League winning manager 99% of the time. But if you're asking me who I think should be manager of the season, undoubtedly should be Nuno, given where he's taken this Nottingham Forest team, potentially getting relegated last season to being on the verge, on the cusp of European football, with a real shout of getting into the Champions League. And I think what he's done well is he's not tried to turn the players into something they're not. They don't necessarily play the most expansive, free-flowing football. He knows the level of the players, and he has played to their strengths, and they've proven a really tough nut to crack. So he deserves a lot of credit for where he's taken this Nottingham Forest side, and where it ends up, well, that's anyone's guess. There's still many games to go. There's still many obstacles in the way, but the prospect of success in the FA Cup, coupled with the league success, Nottingham Forest are having an amazing season. And as a neutral, it's always good to see, first and foremost, a club outside your traditional Big Six playing the role of spoilers, trying to gate crash that. And also Nottingham Forest are a massive club. They've won back-to-back European Cups, would you know? I don't know if anyone's ever heard that, but they have done that. So for them to be back on that stage again would just be an incredible achievement for them, and one that I kind of hope they manage to do, because it just gives hope to everyone then that there's always a chance you can break in, you can break that monopoly. And I think the established Big Six is becoming a myth now, and teams like Nottingham Forest and Bournemouth, we've seen, have punched above their weight this season and shown to everyone what is achievable. So that's a bit of an in-depth look there at Nottingham Forest and the success they're enjoying this season. Will that success continue into the weekend and beyond? In the final part, I will give a little bit of a preview to this game, predictions for what we might see unfold, and who we are likely to see in both 11s. But before I come on to that, let me draw your attention to GSPN. The Global Sports Podcast Network is changing the face of football podcasts. With dedicated daily content for every Premier League team, women's football, fantasy football, and a daily Premier League wrap-up broadcast in 5 different languages, it's your one-stop shop for your daily football fix. Find GSPN wherever you find your usual podcasts. After a mixed bag in January, Fulham have certainly started February in a lot more promising fashion, with 2 victories on the road. Can they make it a 3rd consecutive win? Well, it's probably a bit more challenging considering their home form, and it's quite concerning. Is it alarming? We're probably not at that stage yet. It is difficult to figure out why Fulham's form at home has been so indifferent, and why some of their performances at home have been quite insipid and lacklustre. Not winning at Craven Cottage in the league since Brighton in early December, and in that run they've had fixtures on paper where they would have fancied their chances of collecting a decent points haul. We are likely to see a lot of changes from their last outing in the FA Cup, where they made several changes. They made more than I had anticipated. I thought it would have been a mix of his first choice 11 coupled with players that probably needed a run out, needed some minutes, as it was. Timothy Castagne was the only player that played in that game, that also played in the victory at St James's Park. So you can probably expect another 10 changes for this one. Rodrigo Muniz, his form is encouraging, coming off the bench, scoring the winner against Newcastle. So he'll be pushing hard for a start, but I feel like the form of both strikers has been good. Raul Jimenez excelled in this fixture last season, scoring a couple. He also scored the winner earlier on in the season, so he'll be chomping at the bit. And he's just 1 goal shy of recording 10 Premier League goals, which will be a very good haul for him, considering where he was when he left Wolves, and a lot of doubts about whether he would return to the form when he was playing under Nuno, Espirito, Santo, funnily enough. In terms of the team, I would expect it to be the exact same team as we saw Against Newcastle, thankfully there's no new injuries, just the long-term ones we're well aware of. We know we're not going to see Kenny Tete, Harry Wilson for a couple of months. Reece Nelson, I'm not quite sure at this moment in time the news regarding that, but obviously a new injury setback, so he's going to be on the sidelines for a continued length of time. As far as Nottingham Forest, you're likely to see the same as well. They've had less of a recovery due to playing on Tuesday. But again, they played largely their second string, although their first teamers did have to come on in the end to rescue an embarrassment, rescue a shock cup exit. So there'll be clumps of changes for both sides. You'll see Chris Wood come back into the fold. You'll see Gibbs White. One of the things that surprised me earlier on in the season when the two sides met is how Nuno set up in that game, and it was very defensive. He is a manager that errs on the more cautious side, but his selection surprised me on that day because he left his two wingers out in Alanga and Hudson-Odoi, and we know there's some question marks about Hudson-Odoi's fitness, whether he'll be available for this game. But if he is available, I think it would be within his best interest to start them both, because I feel like they can certainly hurt Fulham. And Nottingham Forest this season are a side that have been used to scoring the first goal, doing it on an incredible 19 occasions, and we've seen defensively how hard they can be to break down. So I think that'll be their game plan here again, and whilst they do score the first goal, they do have that counter-attacking threat with Hudson-Odoi and Alanga. When opposition are having to commit more bodies forward, they can exploit that space in behind, and that's been a hallmark of their success this season, why they've done as well as they have. I would expect him to set up differently from what was a cagey game earlier on in the season, in a game where he was looking to stop Fulham first and foremost, rather than look at his attacking players and what they can contribute in terms of affecting the game. And we have seen Fulham have struggled to break teams down that set up in a similar way to Nottingham Forest, and I would imagine Fulham would have a large amount of the ball in this game. Nottingham Forest rank low down. I think they're lowest, in fact, in terms of possession across all the teams in the league, so that's not an unfamiliar situation for them, and I expect that pattern to continue on the weekend. Fulham to have upwards possibly of 60% possession, 60-65% possession, but that won't bother Nottingham Forest. They have a good shape to them. Defensively, they've been really solid, that Bournemouth game aside, and if they do score the first goal, then it's going to be a real test of Fulham, and my concern is Fulham's inability in the last little period of being able to break teams down that set up in that low block. Teams of less quality than this Nottingham Forest side. And just recently, they just seem to have started games almost in first gear at home, not taking their game to the opposition and getting on the front foot right from the whistle. So that's an element of the game you would want to see improve as we come into the last few months of the season and get back to winning games at Craven Cottage. So, based on the game earlier in the season, am I expecting something similar? I would expect it to be more open. Am I expecting an entertaining, high-scoring thriller? No, probably not. I feel like the first goal is important in this game, and if Nottingham Forest do what they've done so successfully this season, then we all know how hard it is to break them down and how that seems to suit them. So I feel like the first goal is important for Fulham, then it can bring Nottingham Forest out of their shell, and then maybe they can be the ones to pick them apart and have the joy, not quite to the extent that Bournemouth had, but be able to get a result against them. And also just like to see them be a bit more resolute defensively. I think at home they've struggled to keep clean sheets, and Anderson's form has been concerning of late. Timothy Castagna as well, although I do feel he had a better second half display against Newcastle. That being said, do I expect them to keep a clean sheet on the weekend? No. Do I expect them to return to winning ways at Craven Cottage? I do think it is going to be a cagey game up until the first goal, but I feel like the first goal will spring this game into life. I'm going to go for a 1-1 draw, and how Fulham fans would view that one, I guess, on the grand scheme of things, the way Nottingham Forest have been playing, the way they've been performing this season, would a point against them be a bad result to go along with the 3 points they took at their ground earlier in the season? No, it probably wouldn't be, but There will still be Fulham fans that feel that they can haul in the teams above them. I'm less optimistic on that front, just based on what I've seen. I feel like Fulham have just lacked that something extra, which is ultimately why they're ninth in the table and not higher. And Marco Silva will say it in his press conference every week, they should have more points than they do. But they don't, and there's reasons for that. It's not just bad luck, is it? It's not being ruthless enough in games. Defensively, it's just not being switched on at all times. In contrast, Nottingham Forest probably have been a bit more ruthless in front of goal, and defensively they've been excellent as a unit. I see this one ending up as a 1-1 draw, and I'm going to go for Raul Jimenez to notch another goal against Nottingham Forest to go with the one he had earlier in the season, and that will bring up double figures as far as league goals go in the Premier League. What do you guys think? Is 1-1 a bit of a negative outlook? Do you feel like Fulham can return to winning ways at Craven Cottage? All those answers will soon become clear. That'll do it, folks, for today's Friday episode for our preview to the Nottingham Forest game on the weekend. Just to reiterate, this is our 100th episode on the Daily Fulham podcast, so thank you to each and every one of you that have tuned in. Hope you can stick around for the foreseeable future as we begin the charge to 200. I've been Gavin Ruffle, have a good weekend, and I'll catch you next time.
Every club, every day. The Global Sports Podcast Network.